can you tell us about yourself and where you're from originally and stuff like that?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Alicia. I grew up. I was born and raised in Michigan. I went to my undergrad at University of Michigan. So I was
Mm-hmm.
pretty much just in the state
In
of
Michigan.
Michigan for like the first 21 years of my life, and then I came here for grad school.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what? So that was back in 2016. So it's been
2016. Okay.
so yes, I've been in this program for a while now, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I guess coming up on like 7 years, but wrapping up soon.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, and I guess
So, like, how did you decide to go from Michigan to Hopkins? Was it like a specific decision, or you applied to some places in general and then got an admission here?
yeah, I mean, I guess like so I can give both maybe
Uh-huh.
the short story and
Yeah,
also the
yeah.
long story, which the shorter story is essentially that so yeah, I applied to a few different programs. Like I had like sort of landed by the end of undergrad that I wanted to go into graduate school,
Mm-hmm.
and I wasn't quite sure what exactly within like I had always cared a bit about privacy and I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to sort of work in that space.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, and I I mean, like my main approach for applying to schools was like, like not knowing much. Maybe it was similar for you, but I kind of just looked at like the top 15 CS programs, and
Yeah.
then through those, I looked at which ones had faculty that did like research that seemed aligned to what I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so Hopkins actually wasn't on that list. But then I came across it because the professor that I did a little bit of research with at Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
he had collaborated with my current
Okay.
advisor before.
Who is
And
Matt Green?
yeah, so
Uh,
that's Matt Green. So the professor at Michigan was Alex Halderman. He also
mm-hmm.
does like he does a lot of like security stuff, kind of all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like he had worked with Matt before, so then he kind of was like, and based off kind of my interests, he thought that he could be a good fit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd already been like kind of familiar with Hopkins and Baltimore, and I was a fan of both because so my brother went here for his undergrad.
Mm.
He was pre med, like he was a
Okay.
quintessential Hopkins
Okay.
undergrad. It was funny because then he ended up doing his residency at Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
So we like swapped places, and like the way I always like that always like is in my mind is because I don't know if you know this, but the way that Hopkins does its JHIDs
Mm-hmm.
is it's your first name, initial letter, last name, and then a number, and that
Yeah.
number is how many other people have been
Okay.
here
Yeah.
with that same thing. So if you have like a common last name, your
Uh-huh.
number is probably quite high.
Uh-huh.
But then for me, so my last name Chatur, it's not that common. It's usually pretty much just
Yeah.
if you're related to me.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the US, there's only three H Chaturs. There's my dad, there's my brother, and there's me. So almost anywhere, I should just get to be number one, except here at
Except
Hopkins, where I'm
here.
H Chatur too, because he came here first.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you said that you are the only three people in the US with that surname?
Yeah.
Oh, that's like kind of amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's not the most common. Well, because also like a bit of it is just because um, most of my like so the my like family's surname Chatur, like it more broadly is like just going to be my family, but then
Hmm.
like as people also came to the U.S., it got spelled like it got anglicized a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
So it's like even further unique because it's not exactly the same as like some of my other relatives in the U.S. Though I don't think any of them are H tutors. I don't think anyone else
Uh,
but yeah, no,
so
so
is
it's a
it
funny
like
little.
does it originate from Chatur?
Yeah, like it's like it's related to like the Gujarati word, I think,
Ah,
or the Sanskrit word. I guess like it goes back that way.
yeah, the
Yeah.
Chatur is I think Hindi or maybe Sanskrit. Yeah. So that's a good story. So what field of research like do you do? And you talked a little bit about privacy. So why did you think that that was important, and why did you take it up?
Yeah, no. So I mean, I think um, sort of it's always been something I had cared about. I mean, I think part of that was, I mean, like I think privacy came to a lot of people's mind after like the Snowden revelations in like
Hmm.
2014, but then even before that. So um, like kind of coming from like the background of being growing up in the U.S. In this kind of like I guess like I was here like what like I was 6 when like 9/11 happened, so like the
Hmm.
post 9/11 world where things like the Patriot Act existed, that like
Mm-hmm.
there was always this kind of understanding that like and like with that, as like more and more stuff became digital,
Mm-hmm.
there was always this understanding that like the digital world definitely had these new questions about like as we're able to communicate more effectively just like with everyone,
Mm-hmm.
that also like now so much of the conversations we're having are happening on platforms that we don't really understand and we don't really control.
Mm-hmm.
So like kind of both for my own sake, just kind of trying to understand like how is all of that working, and then also wanting to sort of maybe try to help like make sure that things are steered in like the right direction there.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of where this all built up. Though originally the way I thought that I was going to go about all of that was I had growing up been really into law,
Mm-hmm.
and where I was sort of thinking that I was going to end up approaching things was I was going to go to undergrad, then I was going to apply to law school, and then I was going to learn a lot about like kind of like law, like privacy from the legal angle and how to
Mm-hmm.
like do things that way. Um, but then at some point in my undergrad, I sort of realized that like while I found a lot of that stuff interesting, that like I hadn't actually been like I didn't really program or anything until undergrad,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like during undergrad where I got really into computer science, and then like I was exposed to like security research through Professor Halderman, who I worked with. That I was like, oh, like this part is actually really interesting, and like I also like felt like I was like, oh, hopefully at least a little good at it. So like I like felt a connection, and I was like, you know what, like the legal way of approaching this, like it's important, but there are lots of other people kind of already kind of coming at it from that angle,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't necessarily feel like like there were as many people going into those same spaces of like arguing for like privacy rights and stuff, but like coming with all of that technical background, because that's a bit more niche.
Mm-hmm.
And so that felt like the more valuable way of approaching these things. And like um when I came here and like I met with Matt and like we were talking and like kind of just like hearing kind of his perspective on like how to do research, how to kind of approach these things, and like how he cared about like how his research impacts people in that
Mm-hmm.
way, that like really resonated with me. And that's like the big thing that sort of brought me specifically to Hopkins, where
Mm-hmm.
there were like cool people I had met in other places, but then I really felt that, like that connection here, that it was more than just doing the research. It was like trying to ask the right questions, work on the right problems.
Yeah, I'm taking the course of math this semester. Like it's just an audit for the
Oh, his
blockchain course.
blockchains course, yeah.
Yeah, and he's really good. He gets you interested in the ideas.
Yeah, no, he's a really good lecturer for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure like when you were graduating with your bachelor's degree, you would have like some kind of jobs lined up too. So why did you like? Was it just because you were so intrigued by the idea of privacy that you decided to do a PhD, or in general?
That's a good question. I mean, my dad, like, so I'm not like a first generation college grad because my dad had gone to college, but
Mm-hmm.
like not in a way that necessarily asked any questions, right? So like he went into mechanical engineering
Mm-hmm.
and then he was working at Ford, but like so it was sort of like, like it's like, okay, what's the job that sort of, can get me to the US and then can get me to have some work
Yeah.
life. But there was no questions of like, like if once you have the privilege of choice, and
Mm-hmm.
then also like, these different things, like there was no roadmap I had. Like no one I knew, like none of my family had ever been to grad school.
Mm-hmm.
In undergrad, no one really had a choice of what majors to do and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So I was just kind of like, I got to undergrad, I was taking classes and like I was just figuring things out, and I didn't really know what to do. So I did a couple internships. So I interned at Duo Security, which I think they're acquired by Cisco now, but they do like two-factor auth. Um, and then I interned twice at Facebook, working on their security team. So I got like a lot of industry exposure, and it was
Mm-hmm.
cool because I got to have it Duo, when I was working there, it was like only about like 30 or 40 people. It was a very small
Mm-hmm.
group. It was still kind of young in the startup days.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously Facebook is much, much different in terms of like its level of
Yeah.
establishment. So I sort of got to see what like work as like a software engineer looked like, both at that smaller
Mm-hmm.
startup scale and at that bigger scale. And like, and in both experiences they were very positive, and I really did find like, like Facebook has all these perks and like things that like they treat their employees pretty well. Duo had a really nice close knit culture, but then I still kind of realized that like it didn't feel quite like what I wanted to do, because like their work, like I was working on the teams that were doing security and privacy, but there was very specific goals that were already kind of set,
Hmm.
and you're more working towards those goals.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of, still be asking some of those questions.
Yeah, that's precisely what my experience was. So I was working at Microsoft before this,
Hmm.
and it was more of an applied work. You apply all your deep learning knowledge and stuff like that on their recommendation systems. But then if we got stuck in a problem and I wanted to ask the more real questions, we weren't allowed to do that because that doesn't align with the business interests
Yeah.
of the group. So yeah, that's what my motivation was also for doing a PhD.
Yeah, no, that
Yeah,
makes sense. Yeah, I think that's like a very like I feel like that's probably like the very like the common thread for a lot of the people here, where
yeah,
that's what, because especially in CS where industry
yeah,
always is an option, the thing that brought us here instead of there is because we wanted to ask those questions.
yeah. That's true because in CS you'll find good high-paying jobs outside. So it must be something very hard pressing that you want to answer to get into a PhD program.
Yeah.
Uh, what advice, like a general advice, would you give to anyone who is going to graduate on whether they should, or whether or when they should apply for a PhD? Because PhD is a big decision in life.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Like, so like as I mentioned, so I wasn't like, the way I did it, I wouldn't say it was like exactly how I do it again, because I was
Mm-hmm,
just kind of figuring it out as I go.
mm-hmm,
Where my kind of thought process was that I knew that like a PhD, you're not making as much. It's going to be a lot of work and stuff like that.
mm-hmm,
So then what I kind of approached it with was that like if I went to industry first to work for a bit and then did this, like either it wouldn't maybe happen because
yeah,
it would be hard to make that transition,
yeah,
or that I would sort of like, coming from undergrad where you're taking a lot of classes, you're doing work, and you sort of have that more like kind of, like that type of mindset.
mm-hmm,
It seemed that like that would phase more naturally into a PhD program. Whereas if you're working, you have like this very more defined 9 to 5 like schedule you're working on
mm-hmm,
oftentimes, and like it's just very different.
yeah,
Um, so at the time it felt like it made sense for me to go directly into the program. I don't think that was like necessarily the wrong choice, but I think the considerations I'd sort of like keep in mind are that like you don't like that, while that is a bit of the case, like there, like for the most part in at least my experience with the program, like I was definitely like coming straight from undergrad was definitely on the younger side. Many
mm-hmm,
people, do something for a little bit and then come into their program, or even like, they take even more time. Like for example, my advisor, he actually worked for a decent amount of time, and it was only like quite a few years after he had graduated from his undergrad that he ended up coming back for his PhD.
mm-hmm,
And one of the things that I had noticed there was like, while everyone has to take classes for the program, some of the people who spent a little bit of time doing other things and then coming in, they were able to definitely hit the ground running in some ways, because they either had um, just a bit more real world experience, or
mm-hmm,
maybe in their other jobs, they were able to, beyond just what you'd learned in undergrad, they were able to already apply some of those more complex things
mm-hmm,
in practice. And then as a result, they were able to shift into some of that stuff in research.
mm-hmm,
So I think that like, while it sort of made sense for me to go straight from undergrad to grad school, I don't feel like that was a choice of like saving time. I feel
mm-hmm,
like, if it makes sense, you don't see a reason to go and do something else, then I don't think you should not just apply right after
mm-hmm,
undergrad. But I think that if there are other things that you might want to do, whether it's like you maybe want to work for a bit to get some more money, because that also will help with your grad experience and having a bit more, like my internships over the summer, like
mm-hmm,
they were just internships, but an internship at a big tech company still pays well, and it definitely gave me a lot more of a cushion to be able
mm-hmm,
to then during grad school not have to worry too much about some of these more like the considerations.
yeah.
um
And I think it also comes back to the point you made earlier that it's about choice. So whether you have that choice to make, like, can you also work and can you spend 2 years in industry and then come back to PhD and then go through this long process? For me personally, I feel like I did work for like 2.5 years
mhm.
before coming here, and I feel like I'm old now for a PhD or something. But like you said that it's more common here in the US because people have more choice. And is there like a good strategy to apply to PhD schools when you are like when you have already decided that you want to go for a PhD?
Yeah, no, I think so. The big things that both from my process, but then also I guess getting to kind of be on the other side of like I got to, I know at Hopkins and CS, there's sometimes like since each lab sort of does its recruiting on its own, like sometimes the undergrads can also like provide some input onto that process,
Mm,
and like from that, like I got to see a little bit of the other side of like what does it look like when bringing in a student from the perspective of the lab inviting them here. And I think the big things I had noticed are like work well were definitely like I think if you can prior to applying, like definitely try to reach out to that lab in some way. If it's a very prominent professor that maybe you don't think you would be able to like there's it's unlikely that they respond to your email. I mean, it's still worth a shot. I mean, the
mhm,
worst that happens is they just never respond.
yeah.
But they usually have grad students as well, and like reaching out to one of them to at least like learn a bit about the lab, about
Mm,
what the type of research looks like, and just having that like initial conversation, I think lets you get a lot of that useful information that when you're writing your like statement of purpose and stuff that you can sort of be more specific about
mhm,
why you want to come to that specific program or that lab and like why both the fit is good. And I think that like being able to be really clear about that helps a lot because from a lab or a professor's point of view, it's hard just through application materials to really get a sense of someone that you'd be working with for like multiple years, right?
mhm,
So like being able to like make it as easy as possible to sort of make that point clear that they can look and they would be like, okay, yeah, they want to work with me because like these are the things that we are both interested in. This is sort of what they've done so far that helps with that, and this is like sort of what they think is the way that they can kind of continue to learn to be able to like work well. And
yeah.
I think being able to make that clearly can really make those applications strong.
Yeah. Off that point, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how important would you rate your relationship with your advisor in a PhD?
Oh, yeah, definitely like, like 9 to 10. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, they are like, you'll have other collaborators, you'll have a lab,
Hmm.
but at the end of the day, like they are the person that like, like almost everything is going through.
Yeah.
And, like versus like, maybe more of a job type of thing where obviously I'd say even then you'd want to have a good relationship with your manager,
Hmm.
but there tends to be a bit more flexibility, right? Like if it's not feeling like the right fit, there's probably other
Yeah.
opportunities at that company that you can work with a different team. Like there's a process to deal with
Hmm.
that. But here where oftentimes they're really maybe one of very few people that are doing the type of work you want to do, and like even if there is another professor, that
Hmm.
the lab is still like kind of it's a small space and everyone's still kind of like working and interacting together. So as a result, I think you really want to make sure that that is that you feel that there is a good fit there, and that it feels like someone that like it's easy to kind of get into the mindset of wanting to like chase the prestige of a program
Hmm.
or even the prestige of a lab or a faculty, but definitely like think about that like like at the end of the day like you still are going to have to be spending like 4 or 5 even more years into this
Mm.
program, and it's going to be those like just regular interactions that you're going to have to be able to make it through to get to the end, because like the prestige of coming from like a big or like a prominent lab doesn't matter if are
You're
barely able, you can't make it to the end because it's just a horrible experience. So
Yeah, that's definitely true. This is something different in the US that I've seen from other places, which is that you can directly go from your bachelor's to a PhD program, and then you typically get a master's degree in between because you're doing some courses.
yeah.
So this coursework is, I think, kind of a unique quality of this US PhD programs. How do you think like this coursework helps you grow as a PhD student?
It's an interesting question. I'm always a little conflicted about it because I mean, so I think this is something that varies from field to field because like
Hmm.
there are some fields that I think that like just the amount of stuff you learn in undergrad, like it definitely isn't sufficient. Like there
Hmm.
is more you need to learn. That is a little bit true in CS, but I do feel like you kind of fairly quickly get to the core of like
Hmm.
like principles of your research field here. Like there is a little bit you need to do, but that's generally like only maybe a couple of classes. So on one hand, it does feel somewhat like, I guess the fact that you can get a master's in the process is nice, because then it gives you some like completion point kind of in the process. It's
Mhm.
not just you're in like one thing for like multiple years
Mhm.
and you have nothing in the middle to kind of show for that.
Mhm.
But I guess on one hand, I'm conflicted about it, because I feel like you end up spending a lot of those early years like taking classes that, like, because of the different course requirements, aren't really that relevant to your research, and
Yeah.
that you have to balance time. You're taking these classes, but really the big reason you're there is to like research and do work. um, I do think there is something to be said about, like, getting to continue to grow and learn.
Mhm.
And I guess, like, taking more classes at the graduate level, even if they're not in your particular field of expertise, still give you that practice of like, pushing beyond just the level of like material from undergrad.
Or instills like new insights from some other field.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah, like it can like maybe like, by having to take some of those other classes, it gives you a somewhat more well-rounded perspective that you can then take into your own
Yeah.
field. So I think there's benefits, but I do think that like, it can be like, I mean, I think for some groups here, I feel like it works better because there's a lot of different classes that fit under the different types of requirements.
Mhm.
So you can sort of, take a lot of stuff related to your field of expertise and still complete all the requirements. But in some cases, you have to like do a lot of different things.
Yeah.
Like if you're doing like CS theory, you'll probably be able to fulfill the theory requirements, but you're gonna have to really like go outside of that to like take applications or like systems things, which, I mean, that could be good, but it does then mean like you are doing very different things. Whereas like
Mhm.
for privacy and security, we have classes that are more on the theoretical point. We have classes that are more systemsy. We have classes that are more applications.
Mm.
So like we actually can, take quite a variety of classes within our domain
Mm.
that fulfill these different recs. So that experience can, differ, and I
Yeah.
think for some people that might be a bit annoying.
Is there something cool you discovered while you were doing some courses, like which you wouldn't have probably discovered otherwise?
That's a good question. I like that question. Let me think. Um, so I think one of the fun things I discovered during I took one of my like elective courses. It was stochastic processes from
Mhm.
AMS.
Mhm.
So it's a lot of, just being able to model like random processes.
Mhm.
And one thing that was really fun is when we were learning about random walks and stuff. We learned about what is called the arcsine law, which
Mhm.
essentially is, it's something that is used a lot in describing like the probability of, like, say there's a basketball game happening or some sporting event, and like one team is trailing another team. And what the arcsine law basically says is that, like, if that's the case, the like turnovers are like not usually likely to happen. So if a
Mhm.
team is in the lead, the other team will probably, the most likely scenario is that they'll continue to trail,
Mhm.
just because like you can model scores as like a random walk.
Mm.
And the arcsine law sort of says that like what the final probability looks like, like basically, I don't remember exactly what an arcsine curve looks like, but
Mm.
what the arcsine curve looks like basically really shows that the steady state is keeping the differential what it is. It's very,
Mm.
very unlikely for it to flip,
Mm.
which,
That's
like, I mean, is very removed from my research, but it was like a very fun, cool thing to
Yeah,
learn.
and it's kind of intuitive because you're psychologically under pressure. You're unlikely to beat the other guy, but seeing it turn out in math is
Yeah,
also
no, it's cool to see that
yeah,
there's like this actual, like, yeah, like principle of like why we think that it's that way.
yeah. How difficult do you think is coming up with new ideas outside of like stimulating environments like a course or when you're sitting in a class because you're interacting with many people, you are being bombarded with new things. So maybe they instill new ideas. But when you are done with your courses and everything, and now you're sitting on your on your desk, how hard does it feel to come up with new ideas?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, like, I think that's the key question of a PhD. I mean, I think that, like, I think being able to come up with ideas is really, the like, that's what I've actually found those like the biggest kind of takeaway slash, like, like, I guess, sign of growth through the program. Like,
Mm-hmm.
obviously there's all these skills you learn about how to carry out research projects,
Mm-hmm.
but then like the fate of the individual projects, whether like, they like are very successful, result in a good publication, whether it goes in the other direction and maybe they don't go too well and like kind of fall apart a bit, or like anything in between.
Mhm.
Like definitely it's not easy to, even if you're given the problem itself, to complete a research project,
Mhm.
but I think being able to reason about a problem and kind of understand like what it would take for this problem to be like not even necessarily solved, but just the process of approaching the problem,
Mhm.
um, that is hard, and that definitely is, like, yeah, I'd say that was probably the hardest part about the PhD, of figuring out how to do that. I think one of the mistakes I made early on that I kind of realized was sort of exactly that, where it feels like once you sort of leave your coursework and that like direct stimulus, that now you're sort of having to come up with these things in more of a vacuum. But the big thing I think is that you shift how that works. Like I mean, obviously you have your advisor you can talk to, but then like with collaborators, with your lab mates, just like on Twitter with just like random people, you just really start going out and like finding those connections of like just bouncing ideas off as many people as possible, and like
Mhm.
every different kind of like not exactly walk of life, but like from like industry, from practice, from theory, just like really talk to a bunch of different people,
Mhm.
and yeah, like kind of like try to see what sticks. And I think that way you can continue to sort of come up, find these interesting new ideas, and you're not doing that by yourself. It's not just you in a room. You get this feedback that it's just different, because before you didn't have to work to get that. You got to just be in a class and have it sort of they're available to you. So that's one thing you have to sort of build a little bit on your own.
So when you're interacting with these new people, and is it at a point in time, is it related to just a single project, or is it like multiple projects at the same time?
I think so. I think it depends on the specific relationship you have. Like, I mean, a lab mate versus maybe like some researcher you're just kind of reaching out to out of
Mhm.
the blue. I feel like if it's someone I don't know too well, usually it's just more like, oh, like I have this like, or like either an email, or maybe I see someone at the conference and I'm just talking to them. It might just be about like a specific idea and just like seeing what they think,
Mhm.
or more generally like, oh, like in this area of work, is there anything like particularly interesting? If it's someone that I have a closer relationship with, like a lab mate or
Mhm.
someone that I've worked with in the past, maybe there's one specific thing we're talking about right now, but there'll probably be a couple different things. Like it will be more general, where it's like, oh, like I feel like there are a couple interrelated things, and let's talk about each of those, and then like like hopefully one of those starts then developing into a bigger project. Maybe if you're fortunate, more of those do, or
Mhm.
maybe it turns out that that project that it spins out of takes a few different steps, and now you suddenly have a few different, like you have a paper, and then there's some related subsequent work that you need to do, and then you can keep working.
Mhm.
And then that's really great, because then you have like this very like like now a defined like working relationship for the
Mhm.
future, and like ideas for the future.
That's really good. You have been here for long. What is your best like Eureka moment, or something like that?
Um, that's hard. I mean, like a single moment. I mean, because it's weird. Because like, I mean, like I'd say, like like the low points are easy, because it's like, I mean, like I was here before the pandemic, and then the
Uh,
pandemic hit, and then like even now, it's still like not quite the same. But I would say that like I have a lot of fond memories of some of those earlier years. Like especially, I think my third year of my program. So this was the year right before the pandemic.
mhm.
But like I feel like it was really quite that point where me and like a lot of my cohort, like we had finished our coursework. We were like transitioning into research projects,
Mhm.
and like we would be talking a lot, like both about research, just about like like being here in Baltimore and doing other things. And the department felt very close and very like very like everyone knew each other well, was the
Mhm.
sentiment I got. So like I have a lot of great memories about like that time, where like it just very felt like there was a lot going on. There was always things, like people to talk to and things to do. Like we used to have like we'd have like board game nights, and we're bringing those back a little bit. But then like I feel like people are starting to come in more frequently, but back then everyone was just always around. So
Mhm.
you could do those things a bit more spontaneously. We'd have like people would just like give like quick presentations about their research, and then people would get like, and we'd bring in like pizza and drinks and stuff. Um, so that was like a very like I feel like that was like kind of if I had to pick like the golden period of my PhD program, I feel like that's where I really have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fondness for. A particular moment inside of that, I don't.
No, I mean,
It's hard to.
like a Eureka moment, which means like you had an epiphany about your research where you thought that, okay, this is like something groundbreaking or something like that.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying. I think one thing that was really exciting was so I was working on there was like we call them like SOKs, systemization of knowledge. They're
Mm-hmm.
kind of like literature reviews, but then a bit more in detail. It's not just doing a literature review, but then you want to come up with some insights that you've received based off the literature review.
Mm-hmm.
Like the what did that process of systematizing all of these things teach you?
Mm-hmm.
So I was working on one of those, and in that process, I like came across sort of like I was looking at some older paper, and there was kind of this like it was almost like a throwaway line of how to do one part of this protocol that they were just like, oh, like there's this easy, like there's this trivial way that this can be done, but then they didn't really specify it, and there was no one actually ever really specified that. It was
Mm-hmm.
just something. It's like, oh yeah, we can probably do this. It's understood.
Mm-hmm.
But then I like looked around, and because I was like going through all these papers, and I realized that like no one actually went down and verified that it was in fact trivial. Because like one thing I feel like is so common in research is once you actually start looking at something that feels trivial, it turns out there's a lot of nuance into it.
Yeah.
So I looked into that, and it turned out, oh, like there's actually there's it's kind of interesting in terms of how to actually model that into a thing, and it ended up being like it required a bit of thought and a bit of work. And it ended up becoming a paper, and that was like really exciting because it just like it kind of it didn't come like I mean it wasn't create like the type of insight that was like, oh, like here's like a just kind of like out of the blue like some like insightful thought, but like but it was very exciting to just like just be reading all these papers, come across like just like one line that like
Yeah.
something that it just is obvious but not obvious, and then realize like, oh wait, like there is something here. So that was really cool.
Yeah. And how do you think, like, how stressful is the whole PhD thing, and how does it compare with undergrad? Um,
I mean, I think the hardest thing is even with undergrad where you're like taking classes and maybe in some ways it feels like it should be the most similar.
mhm,
Though like I feel like, PhDs being like school definitely is a bit of a misnomer because, you're doing so much beyond coursework and so
mhm,
much is like just of a different breed, right? Like it's more about building knowledge than learning about things.
mhm,
But I think the hardest thing because of that is unlike undergrad, unlike industry, there's just so little structure. Like you might have deadlines for papers and conferences and journals that you might be like sort of building your timeline around. You
mhm,
might have lab meetings and like meetings with your advisor. But despite all of that, for the most part, kind of the main person checking to make sure all of those things are happening is you, right? You really have to be effective at managing your own time,
yeah,
and you don't really have like in undergrad when you have classes, you generally every week had some homework assignment or you had a syllabus that was telling you exactly how things were going to go.
yeah,
So you really knew there was no question. Like you sort of knew every day, oh, these are the things I have to get done.
mhm,
In industry, you have a manager that like is going to be, on your case, making sure that like, if you're not doing things
yeah,
in a timely fashion, you don't have your things in order, they're going to be checking in on you.
mhm,
But the thing I think that was like very stressful for me and like took a bit of work is yeah, figuring out and I because I don't think there's one answer for everyone, but like figuring out with that undefined time, how do you build it in a way that works for you, that you're actually still getting your work done,
mhm,
even when like there's no one you really have to answer to in like a very
yeah,
frequent way.
yeah. It's hard to overcome this procrastination
Yeah,
habit because like there's no hard defined rules for you. You have to define your own rules and
exactly. Yeah.
impose artificial deadlines so that you are on top of your stuff. What do you think about imposter syndrome and how common is it in
Oh,
PhD students?
I feel like like show me a student that doesn't have imposter syndrome. Like I think
Okay.
because there's just so many different versions of it. Whether it's like every research project's different, so they all progress differently. So some people they work on a project and maybe it progresses really quickly, and then so suddenly like now like there's someone maybe in your cohort that has a few publications and you're feeling behind in that regard,
Mm-hmm.
or like you're looking you talk to your advisor, you talk to all these established researchers, and you see so much of like, like all of the things they've accomplished. But I think with all of those things, like, research, like other things, it's very much seeing highlight reels, right? You see the publications people get. You don't necessarily see what's still like, constantly having to get resubmits, or what like took 5 times to finally get accepted. You don't see like the projects that never worked out and all of that. So I think like, it's very easy to like kind of like, yeah, like, go onto someone's webpage or Google Scholar, or just like have a conversation with someone
Yeah.
and just kind of be like, like, wow, like, like I am just like, I feel like there's always a constant feeling of feeling behind.
Yeah.
But then like you have to kind of remember that like, you're really the only person doing the exact type of research you're doing. So that, these heuristics, like maybe there's some value sometimes in like at least kind of trying to get a sense of where you are. But like if you focus a little too much on them, you're going to definitely, freak yourself out a bit, and like unnecessarily, because the thing is like, like you made it this far, there has to be a reason for that, so you should trust
Yeah.
yourself a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. What's one skill that gets you way ahead in your PhD that is usually given less credit for?
That's a good question. If I had to pick, I mean, so I think like one thing that I mean, kind of going back to some of the stuff I said before about like coming up with ideas, I think building up a nice, good collaboration network is a really, like if you have something like that, I think it will go a long way, both like through your PhD, and then even depending on what you want to do after, like that relationship continues. And I feel like, like because of like the idea that, what you're working towards is like your defense and your dissertation and stuff, you can often get into this mindset that like, at some point my research is now like this like singular sole responsibility on me, that like maybe other people are on these projects, but like it's about what I'm doing. And then that can sort of, maybe make you not think as much about like, oh, I should still be talking to people, reaching out, trying to build out this network and work with all of these other people. But that's really where you get that guarantee that there's people you can rely on to talk about ideas with, to like, like help you get to the finish line. Because, I feel like, at least in my experience, research projects are generally the first 90% and then the last 10%, and those are equally hard. So then like having the people that you're working with, like, be the ones that can get that last 10%
Yeah.
to where it needs to be is huge. And that's really what I think sets you up for success well. So like that's the big thing I would encourage. And like I
Yeah,
think
that's
that's the
really
thing I
important
learned.
because currently the projects I'm working on, it's hard to find collaborators on that project. So
Yeah, and then
we'll
yeah,
try to
let's
achieve.
yeah, like especially earlier on in my PhD, my projects were mostly just like me and my advisor. So
Mhm.
similarly, like it was a lot of like yeah, a lot of those pieces and fell to me. And then yeah, like that's a that's a lot of pressure on just one person.
Yeah,
And like yeah, no, it's tough. So yeah, I think continuing to have those conversations and getting those relationships can really help.
yeah. And what's one myth about PhD that like people usually have outside of PhD? So there could be two types of people. One is like people who are undergrads or someone, and they maybe think about PhD as a certain thing, which is not really true. And about people in general, when they hear about a PhD, what do you like? What perception do they have, which is not usually true?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think that like I think there's a couple of them. So like for undergrads, I think maybe the big thing is not realizing how, because I think the main way they interact with PhD students is often as TAs,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe not realizing that, like, I mean, this is also true broadly, but I don't think undergrads always realize how involved PhD students are with like the research aspects of work,
Mm-hmm.
because first and foremost, they know them as like the people who help with classes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And like they know that there are these professors and that there's research happening. But then I don't think they necessarily get exposed to, unless they like, maybe are fortunate enough to get an opportunity to like work with someone in undergrad, and then they get exposed to that lab. Otherwise, like, I mean, this was a little bit of my experience when I was a undergrad as well, where like I knew PhD students existed. I knew like they like were related to doing research, but then like I didn't really understand like what that looked like. I was like, oh yeah, like there's PhD students, they're doing something,
Mm-hmm.
they exist. But so I think that's one thing undergrads don't always realize, of how much like that they are like the PhD students are the ones for the most part, writing these papers, really like pushing this research forward with like the guidance of a professor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think more generally, I think people like I get this in my family a lot where they're just always sometimes confused of like, first of all, it like not being school in like the sense of like, a med program or a law
Mm-hmm.
program where, other types of like professional degrees where it is for the most part about coursework and like, that's really what you're doing where, the after your first couple of years, right? Like we are, we have structured like or like maybe not structured, but we have like, actual work that needs to be done that
Mm-hmm.
like, we are spending all day, like, writing code, like writing sections of papers, like
Mm-hmm.
creating definitions, doing all this other work. So I don't think people always realize that like really what a PhD is more akin to is like an apprenticeship. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're signing up to have some senior person kind of like guide you and like train you, but then you're kind of you're doing that work that you're being trained for, right? That like a PhD can be a stepping stone, but the PhD already is the thing that like a PhD is a stepping stone to a research position, but it is already doing that research. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like med school where okay, I guess by the end you might do like internships or rotate, but like the med school is a stepping stone to becoming a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
and then you now go from learning about how to do these things to doing these things.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly in like law school or like in business school, but in a PhD program you're already doing those things that you'll be doing for the rest of your career.
Yeah.
You are just doing it in kind of a training environment, and then you get to start being the one leading those things as you continue to progress.
Mm. That's a nice way to put that. Um, and what's the worst thing about PhD?
I mean, I think the hardest part maybe is that like oftentimes it can get a bit isolating. I think that's the big thing. Like that's like one of the things from like my experience in industry that I can sometimes miss where because you tend to work in like kind of a smaller group and you're like you because on one hand you get the freedom of choice and autonomy and kind of asking your own questions, but the more you kind of are building your own path, the fewer other people that are also walking on that same path. So it
Mm-hmm.
can like you sometimes you look around and you're like, oh, I guess yeah, like like you're sort of on your own. Or even if you have a couple of collaborators, they might not first of all be like physically nearby, but even then, it's like that's not that big of a group of people. Where like you sometimes what I miss is that feeling of like being part of a team, being part of kind of a broader mission, because then you actually feel like there is some type of connection. So I think that like that feeling of isolation that comes up sometimes where you're just like, yeah, like I'm kind of doing this on my own and like, yeah, like that it feels a bit disconnected. That can
Mm-hmm.
be, I think, what definitely is like not one of the more fun parts of doing a PhD.
And what are the fun part? Like, what's the best thing?
I mean, the best thing, I mean, there's a few. I mean, I think like when you like in the process of like when you're in those first stages of a research project and you're like really fleshing out a lot of like the core ideas,
Mm-hmm.
when it's just like you and your collaborators like in
Mm-hmm.
a room just like whiteboarding, like just like figuring out what it looks like. I think that's one of my favorite pieces, like
Yeah.
just like how are we doing this thing, let's talk,
Yeah.
because then like the creativity is flowing,
Yeah.
everything's kind of on the table at that point. Like it's just so there's just so much like that can happen at that time, whereas like like the rest of a research project, it's not bad, but then it gets more into the more
Routine.
routine pieces, right? You have to write the sections, you need to like, you have to refine the models.
Yeah.
It's important work, but it's not the same as that first piece where like that's really where I feel like the excitement
Yeah,
is.
that's true.
So I love that. I mean, I love like talking to people both like in my program, but getting to talk to like other PhD students just in CS and other
Mm-hmm.
departments, just seeing people who are like sort of in both in the same position as me, but then doing wildly different things. Like it's just
Mm-hmm.
so cool to see the different ways that PhDs can happen, and then going to conferences and like meeting the broader community, I think is
Yeah.
also very exciting, and like feeling connected like to that bigger thing is
Yeah.
a cool experience.
You get to travel.
Yeah, you got to go if you're lucky enough that your conferences are in fun places. Yeah, you got to go on some cool trips.
Yeah. What advice would you give someone who is thinking about like going for a PhD? Why should they and why shouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of those things where, I mean, so I'm not going to say this is the only answer to that
Mhm.
question, but like where I sort of fell onto this for the longest period of time was that I never tell anyone like, oh, the thing you should do is do a PhD program. Like,
Mhm.
um, like if it's already something that they're considering, and then I think it's good to look into that and then like consider it. But like I feel like to do a PhD program requires a lot of sacrifice. It requires a lot of dedication and like resolve. And it's not the only way to do a lot of the things you tend to want to do. Like even if you want to do cutting edge work, there tend to be ways you can find that in industry or in some other setting. If you are, there's ways that you can keep up to date with research without necessarily, like, you can become a science writer. You can, maybe just stay up to date with some of this, like still come to go to more of the professional conferences.
Mhm.
um, or you can like you maybe explore other ways, like maybe you just like create a hobby where you blog about these things, like that. I guess like it's important that to remember that like not doing a PhD doesn't mean you can't necessarily do a lot of the things you might want to do,
Mhm.
but there are benefits definitely to doing a PhD. There are specific doors, like especially like if your dream is to become a professor, it's important to understand that that is like that is a dream of a lot of people, and that's a reason, like that is a good dream to have, but it is a very hard path because there's a PhD, then there's tenure track. So you
Mhm.
want to really make sure you understand what you're getting into, and
Mhm.
like know that you at least potentially think that is worth your time.
Mhm.
So I guess like yeah, like my answer to that would be like if someone is thinking about a PhD just because they're like, oh well, like like I don't think I want to go into industry yet. Like they they're thinking about it just because like they're seeing a kind of like more school as a way of like being able to prolong that like decision of what to do.
Mhm.
Then I don't think that they will have a good time because of
Mhm.
how much you really need to have like some amount of clear focus, and especially because like without that it's going to be hard to pick the right lab, the right advisor, and stuff like that. So in that case I probably would tell them to maybe consider other options, because like the PhD program isn't exactly what they might be envisioning it is. But for people who it is clear that they won't be satisfied with having to like not be able to ask those questions, that they do have that like itch to understand these things more and be involved with them,
Mhm.
and especially yeah, and that like that they want to kind of work in more of that environment that has a little bit of that autonomy, and like um like gets to like let you kind of decide a way forward, then I would encourage it. And I think that like like PhDs in academia, like that's something very unique that they can offer that not many other types of work can.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's sort of I think where I've fallen on this.
Yeah. So let's talk about career like outside after PhD. So, or like even during PhD, like internships and industry jobs. When you are working on a lab, are you expected to do internships in summer?
So at least for our lab, it definitely varies on what you're like, I guess what you want. So we're like our lab is a bit flexible where you can spend your summers doing continuing to just focus in on your research. You can spend them like, if you want, if especially if you're considering either like working in industry or just building better connections with people in
Mm-hmm.
industry. You can do an industry internship. You can work with like maybe a different professor somewhere else if you want to build up your collaboration network.
Mm-hmm.
So like my first summer I spent working with a different professor at a different university. My second summer, I spent working at a company. And then kind of after that, so I worked with I then continued to like work with a couple other professors during the summer because I realized what I really wanted was to build my like research collaboration network. But then I also spent a couple of those summers just focusing in on getting my own research done, because like being able to do it, like the summer is a nice time where there's not too many distractions and you can like really focus in on like
Mm-hmm.
getting some stuff done.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so it's kind of up to our choice. I mean, I think I know for some labs there tend to be like some more like clear expectations of like generally doing things one way or the other, especially if those professors have like specific ties to some like companies or some institutions. I do think that getting both of those is valuable because, especially as you're trying to decide what you want to do next, it's good to kind of feel like, what does it feel like to be a researcher in industry? What does it feel like to, like work with a few different types of people? So you can, because your advisor probably has one way of doing research, but that's not the only way to do research. So you want to broaden those horizons and
Yeah.
see what that feels like in different environments.
Yeah. How does getting a PhD change the type of jobs that you can get in the industry?
Yeah, I think the big thing is, so like the big thing that a PhD, as far as I've seen, has opened doors is like when you have one, what the understanding is that like there tend to be people who work on the research teams at a lot of companies that didn't come from a full, PhD background. They might have had a master's in that field, they might have not, and they might have just been working on that team, for
Mhm.
long enough that they've gathered a lot of that experience, and
Mhm.
they essentially have the same experience, but through kind of more of a practical approach
Mhm.
to it. But I think the big thing that like a PhD opens is there's this understanding that what you know how to do is not just like work on research, but yeah, come up with those ideas
Mhm.
and kind of lead research.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what the door is open, because it's not just that you're coming in with these technical skills, you're coming in with like management skills, you're coming in with like product under like
Yeah.
or product slash project understanding skills and all of that. So it gives you kind of this like higher level of responsibility that you would either have to work a much longer time to get to, or you might not be able to like directly apply to otherwise.
Yeah. And what do you think about the recent tech layoffs?
Yeah, I mean, like it seems like definitely, like I guess I haven't heard too much of how it impacts different levels of the chain, because
Mhm.
generally, like if you're a PhD student, you would be like the things you're applying for are, first of all, probably not things that, there are too many of those at each company, right? There's
Mhm.
probably only a couple of those roles, so it probably isn't usually the role that's getting downsized.
Mhm.
But of course, like, like since you're also working on research teams, which tend to be more ambitious or future forward,
Yeah.
then like if there is a downturn, companies might become more,
Conservative.
conservative and like careful. So maybe they might not be looking to grow those as much. So it's hard to say. I mean, on one hand, like yes, it does seem like hiring is slowing, and that can be a bit challenging. But on the flip side, I'm not sure how much that will affect very specialized roles like the ones PhD students are looking for.
Okay. And what about you? I know that you're trying to get into academia and like postdocs. What is that route and how is it different from like
Yeah, so I guess like so I'm currently looking at postdocs, but I think the big thing is, so I am looking to stay in academia to some extent, but I think there's a couple different ways of doing that. For example, one, as I mentioned, like kind of the most conventional way is where you then go at some point on the job market, the academic job market, and you go for tenure track jobs. One thing I sort of had found over the last couple of years is, while I do really like my research, that it the amount of commitment that going for that full like academic position
Mhm.
requires wasn't exactly what felt like a good fit for me, because there's a limited selection of academic jobs. So if location is something that's important to you, you don't
Mhm.
really have a lot of control over that. You're going to have to work really hard for those next 5 years. I mean, beyond that, but especially there, to build up your lab, to get funding, to really get enough research to have good progress on tenure.
Mhm.
And that just didn't feel like the right fit for just like kind of where my priorities were. So then what I started looking at more were more beyond tenure track, like research jobs. There are jobs that involve like, maybe like a 50% teaching split, or like a more significant teaching split, where then your funding is a bit more stable because it's coming from your role in teaching. Obviously, you don't have as much time to do research, but depending on what type of field you have, whereas like, for example, for me, my research doesn't require too much in the way of like expensive equipment and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So even like, so then like it's not like contingent on being able to bring in very, very large grants. Like obviously, like you'd still be applying for those, but you get a bit more flexibility, and those tend to seem like they have a bit more of a stable balance of work and life that appeals to me. But then kind of before going to that step, I think what is good, I mean, whether you're going for a full academic job, but even for something like this, is you really want to make sure you feel confident in your abilities as an independent researcher. And I think that's one of the things that a postdoc can be very good for, because you get to now kind of move on from the environment you've been in so far to a somewhat new environment, working with some new people, but then also taking up a bit more responsibility, right? You're not just a PhD now. You are going to like maybe, help with the growth of some PhD students in the new lab you're joining. You might teach a bit more and, like scale up your responsibilities, but then also do more research. So you can sort of get some more of that experience and like get a better sense of like understanding, yes, academia is what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And the process of kind of reaching out for those postdocs, at least in CS, I do think this is something that does vary from field to field. Some of them are a bit more formal, where postdocs tend to be official positions that you would then apply for and go through some process. But in some cases, it's more informal, where it's more kind of through the connections you've built so far or through the relationship your advisor have,
Mm-hmm.
that you'd reach out to these people and see, do they have the funding? Do they have the time? Do they have the interest to take you on as a postdoc? And then if that feels like a good fit, then usually that it happens a bit more in that informal way.
Yeah. Okay. About these top universities, if you want to do a postdoc there, then is it like a more formal process or informal?
I think it's less about the university itself, and it's much more about the way the field works and the
Okay.
way the lab works. So,
Mm.
like in my since my field tends to be a bit more informal with its postdocs, even like if you're looking at one of these larger, like more prominent universities, it would still be that doesn't really come into play. What comes into play is reaching out to those professors and seeing if that's a good fit, depending on what they think,
Mm-hmm.
and that would still kind of look the same way.
And what about life outside of work? What's your work-life balance? And
I guess it varies. I mean, I think like definitely early in my program, but then like this can also still come up is like, when you have deadlines and stuff, you sometimes, even if you did have a bit of a work-life balance, you kind of have that skew.
yeah.
Um, I think one of the things that was a bit nice, um, I guess like post-pandemic, that was an adjustment I made that ended up working well, was I spent a big chunk of that time at home in Michigan. And so my parents were there, they were working remotely, and they were kind of on this 9 to 5 schedule. Whereas like before that point, my schedule was, sort of depending on when my meetings were, like, I'd get up when I'd get up, I'd work till I was done for the day. That could be super late, that could be not that late, depending on like how much needed to be done. But then I wanted to sort of just be on that same schedule because it just like made sense, because like that's when the house was quiet, that's when like there
Mhm.
wasn't too much going on. So then I sort of started my day then, and then ended at 5, and then that was great because then I was like, okay, now I can actually feel like the rest of the day I can do other things. And I even once I came back from home, I came back like the campus reopened and stuff, I sort of tried to continue that. It doesn't always stay true. When you have a deadline, you still, you have to put in the hours and the hours. But I think doing that, and I think what I try to do, even if I have to work very much, I picked this up from one of my friends who is in a PhD program, but you pick one day of the week and you really protect that day. Like,
Mm.
you know, if you in general, hopefully you have your whole weekend to you, but even if you have a deadline coming up, you work all day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but then you still save that one day, because even if there's a deadline that needs to happen, like if your brain is just like overwhelmed, you're not going to be able to get that work done.
Yeah.
So like just really setting aside some time for yourself, I think, is big.
Mm-hmm.
um Trying to have some type of like, like exercise can look very different in a lot of different ways. For some people, that's cardio. For some people, that's like, like going to the gym, doing other things. But like having something, I think that when so much PhD work is just so mental and so like,
Mm-hmm.
just thinking about things, having something to balance that out where you're now doing something that like is more active, I think keeps you from going a bit crazy, and like, yeah,
Yeah.
like don't spend all of your time just in your lab. Like I try to make like like I've been here long enough that I'm fortunate to have seen so much of Baltimore, so much of like the broader, like the DMV area and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And like like looking around, like if there's like a club that like has like a hobby that you find interesting, joining that, so that you have friends. Like hopefully you have friends within the program, but like having friends outside the program, because they're the ones that are going to keep you from getting too absorbed in your work and
Yeah.
make sure you go out and do things. So
Yeah. That's good advice. And do you also cook or how?
yeah. I mean, so right now I haven't been, just because while I've been wrapping up, things have been a bit busy, so I've fallen a bit on the wayside. But then yeah, like I was meal prepping for a while, and that was convenient. I do like, so I'm not the like, I'll meal prep, but I'm when I cook, I like more kind of just like coming like finding some new recipe and like just like getting like kind of more experimental and trying to learn a new thing. But then that takes some time. So I that's something I like to do like when I have free time on weekends and stuff. But then yeah, definitely like when I do have like a week available to me, like I'll try to like meal prep for that week as well, just because I think that can like be a nice way of eating healthy and not having to like sometimes I struggle with like figuring out like, oh, when should I have breakfast, when should I have lunch, when should I have dinner. So just having that planned out ahead of time can be nice.
So saying that you don't cook that often, what are your usual meals like? You go out and take food, or?
Yeah, so I mean, like, so when I'm not cooking, it usually looks like, I mean, so on campus here, like levering, like the cafe here is usually the easiest option. Like it's, it's not amazing food, but like it gets the job done, or like just like, yeah, like trying to like go like sometimes like depending on like where I'm going, like sometimes like I Chipotle is something that can be fast, and like what I can do is, you can really load up your bowl and then like turn it into two meals if you
Yeah,
like are trying to like live on a little bit of a on the cheaper side. But
yeah,
yeah, no, it's I don't I do it mostly when I have a lot to get done, but when I do have a chance to like cook or meal prep, I do prefer that, just because when I know the food actually is like healthy and homemade, it just
yeah.
definitely like you
Feel
feel
better.
better for sure.
Yeah. And do you like to play any sports or have any hobbies outside?
Yeah, so I mean, so I fell off this a little bit. So I used to play a lot of ping pong. So like I used to go like Hopkins and like yeah, most places I think usually have like a table tennis
Mm-hmm.
club. I think the city has one as well. So I used to go to that. It like used to happen on like Fridays and like Sundays.
Mm-hmm.
So that was fun. I did a bit of like intramural soccer earlier. So CS actually had like a team that like they would always like have that actually did pretty well. I think it won a few times while I was here.
That's really
Um,
nice.
but yeah, so that was always a fun thing to do. Um, Other than that, I mean, so I think most of the time, like I enjoy just kind of like going to the gym and like running and like doing other things as well. Like I feel like that's usually what a lot of like my like exercise kind of looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'll go on a run and like put on a podcast, and that can be a nice way of both like thinking about something that doesn't work, like getting some exercise, and like especially when the weather is nice, you can like explore a bit of other parts of the city.
Yeah.
So that's fun. Like I actually, so I was training for a half that was supposed to happen March of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So then that didn't happen because everything closed down. But then I really wanted to do a half at some point, and then this past October I did the Baltimore Running Festival's half. So that was really fun.
Oh,
But yeah.
um, doing long distance runs, like I told you before,
Yeah.
is
But I mean, yeah, but it sounds like, I mean, like you sound like you're way more of a runner than me. So
I'm not a runner. I just like try to cut down on the time. So
that's
yeah,
impressive. My mile time is not good.
yeah, that's fine. And are there any social causes you care about and are actively participate in?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the big ones for me are like, I mean, so like as you know, but like one thing that like especially the last couple of years I've been very involved with was the unionization effort on campus,
Mm-hmm.
because I do care a lot about the state of graduate students on campus. Like like one of the reasons why I like help running the happy hours is like it's important to know that there's at least some things happening that encourage students to not just think about their work and to focus on other things. But that doesn't like solve all of these problems. Like I was just talking about how like like budgeting for meals and stuff like that, like you'd want to make sure that grad students like don't have to worry too much about like being able to eat healthy and like have
Mm-hmm.
all of these things. So like I think that is something that was like something that I was very passionate about, and like it's been very exciting to see how that has grown and moved, because like it does seem like it's going to make a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
um so that's probably the biggest one that really like has been, I guess that's basically been a hobby of mine, because most of my free time has sort of gone towards organizing and like really working on that.
Yeah, and I really appreciate it. How difficult is it to find love during a PhD?
um that's a good question. I mean, like, so I guess to preface, so like I'm currently single, so like I guess it can vary, but I mean, I think the biggest thing, like, it really falls back into what we were just talking about with having that work-life balance. If you're spending all of your time in lab, you're probably going to not really meet anyone. But like the thing is, there's just so much, like you should remember that you're on a campus with a lot of other people. There's a lot of other events going on. Like there's so many opportunities to like, both do the things you like doing and as a result find other people who are also enjoying doing those things, and like and that can be a really great way of meeting people. And like I've definitely met some people that way. I have lab mates, other people I know here who've met their partners that way. So it's definitely something that can happen and definitely is doable. But it's not going to happen if you're spending all of your time just on your work.
And I guess like because you have not been outside the academic world like ever, or like maybe in the industry for internships or something, but I've heard from people that it's so much more difficult to find these things outside of of the university life. So
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I think definitely like, yeah, some of the things that can be hard when you're in like at a company is I mean, on one hand, I think because of the structure, there is a lot more like people you come into contact with. I think a lot more people, and like there's a lot more going on work wise. Whereas here, like if you're not making the effort, you can easily not run into anyone.
yeah.
But on the flip side, I think there's way more interesting things that you can more easily come across, like like yeah, fun events, like teams, clubs, all of that type of stuff that yeah, like if you're at a job, you won't just find those things. They're usually probably not going to be internal to the job. You more kind of have to like do the work of like looking at like what's going on in your city, and like you're going to have to cast a much wider net. And yeah, for my friends in industry, that has also been something that definitely has been challenging. I think the big thing that can help there is at least you do tend to have a bit more of work-life balance. So you're a bit more guaranteed to have the time to go out and do those things,
Yeah.
even if you have to work a bit harder.
You have to be more proactive, probably.
Yeah, you have to be more proactive, but then you have free weekends that you can be proactive, whereas you might not necessarily here if you're not being careful.
Yeah. Okay, final question. What is one or more life lesson that you learned during your PhD, which is like really important?
That's a good. I mean, like, so one of them I think kind of goes along with this ongoing theme, but I think applies in many cases, which is like learning how to set boundaries well. And those boundaries come in many forms. There's work-life balance where you understand that even if you really love the work you're doing, that the best thing for that isn't to spend all of your time. You need to take a break and think about other things, because that's what lets you take a fresh perspective. That's what lets you recharge. And similarly, in the other aspects of your life, you need to be able to know how to set those boundaries with like the relationships you have, with like like whether that's with family, with your friends, with anyone you're seeing. Like you need to be able to know how to set boundaries in terms of like like your living conditions, like if you have roommates and stuff, and just like yeah, like knowing how to kind of like know what you need and prioritize that, I think is something that both from a work perspective, but just as someone going through their 20s during this program, like just for life in general, I think that's a big one that had like come across for me. And I think you usually learn it the hard way, but like hopefully that's something that once you learn it, you recognize that it's important, and then you keep doing that. um Alongside that balance, like like that, you know you can't just be doing one thing all the time. Like yeah, I mean they're all kind of the same, but like kind of just different flavors of that like realizing how much like the one there I have those months that I'm just so focused on work that I like kind of let going to the gym fall on the wayside, or like I'm not really cooking, or I'm not really like taking care of my apartment as closely, versus the months where I'm doing all of those things and just like recognizing how much better like I feel, like remembering like yeah, like it's exactly when you don't feel like you have the time to do those things that you should be doing them, because that's what's going to keep you like from going like spiraling.
Yeah, kind of what I'm doing right now because I don't have the time to do this, but I put myself in this situation.
Exactly,
Anyways,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it was really nice to have this conversation, and I hope like this helps some other people
Yeah,
if I
no.
put it out correctly. Um,
Yeah, no, it's fun talking about these things. Yeah, I mean, I guess like as I'm wrapping up, it's a little fun to kind of
yeah,
reflect on
reflect
stuff.
on all those years here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Sure.